Good evening. For my webinar assignment, I decided to focus on the question, should NATO imply a no-fly zone over Ukraine? As the proposition, I declare that it is NATO's obligation to do so. Introduction. On February 24th of this year, Russia launched a full-scale war by bombing airports and military airstrips across Ukraine. After more than 4 months of war, Russia continues to drop bombs to kill civilians and destroy Ukrainian architecture, residencies, hospitals, and sacred areas. Ukrainian officials have asked NATO to help them close and protect the sky by creating a no-fly zone. However, they refused and are going back on humanity and past promises. Despite Ukraine not being a part of NATO, there are official contracts and agreements that indicate NATO's obligation to Ukraine. To establish my point, I will indicate 4 key pieces of information that prove NATO should imply a no-fly zone effective immediately. For starters, NATO was created to fight Russian aggression, and the fact that Russia continues to attack Ukraine disproves NATO's own origins. Secondly, countries that are part of NATO have signed a contract called the Budapest Memorandum that outlines a pact that in the case Ukraine is attacked, those countries will provide assistance. Thirdly, the unprotected sky is leading to people being killed, which goes against NATO's mission. Lastly, I will introduce a reference to prior precedents to no-fly zones that will prove that NATO's ignorance is out of laziness rather than political reasoning. Due to these arguments, NATO is obligated to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine effective immediately, as they are bound to do so based off of circumstantial evidence. For my first argument, I would like the audience to recognize the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created to provide collective security against the Soviet Union, now Russia. On NATO's official website, it specifically states, and I quote, "The North Atlantic Alliance was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its purpose was to secure peace in Europe, to promote cooperation among its members, and to guard their freedom. All of this in the context of countering the threat posed at the time by the Soviet Union." In this quotation, NATO outlines their origins, that in the case the Soviet Union, now Russia, imposes any threats, they will be forced to secure peace. This is a means of putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine, as Russia is imposing serious global threats that falls under the category of NATO's mission statement. For my second argument, I will bring up the Budapest Memorandum. This was a political assurance signed in 1994 where countries had to respect and honor Ukraine's sovereignty, borders, and independence. In this treaty, countries like the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, and the Russian Federation signed an agreement that in the event where Ukraine's independence or borders are compromised, then they are to protect the country in crisis and in this case in wars. Given that NATO does not want to interfere in the war, they still have an agreement to uphold by at least protecting the sky. In the fourth point of the memorandum, it states, and I quote, "The United States of America, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland reaffirm their commitment to seek immediate United Nations Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine. As a non-nuclear weapon state party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used." To explain, Ukraine is part of a non-nuclear treaty, and in order to have joined it, they were meant to give up their nuclear weapons. For those who do not know, before 1994, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear weaponized country, and when they gained independence, they were forced to choose between the assurance of freedom or the propriety of nuclear weapons. With the assurance of freedom, the countries that signed the memorandum must uphold assistance in times of aggression towards Ukraine's sovereignty and in times of threat of nuclear aggression from another country. The United States and the United Kingdom are part of NATO and are one of the only countries blocking the no-fly zone law. This can be interpreted as illegal since they both signed an agreement to help Ukraine. Right now, bombs are being thrown down on Ukrainian civilians, and there is a serious threat of nuclear weapons being used. As stated again in the fourth point of the Budapest Memorandum, the country should aid Ukraine if it should become a victim of an act of aggression, the bombing of civilians, literal war, or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used, which Russian President Vladimir Putin is threatening to do. For my third argument, I would like to shine a light on how the unprotected sky over Ukraine is leading to people being killed, which goes against NATO's ideologies. Today is day 120 of the war, and the losses of innocent Ukrainian civilians have reached over 14,000 people. Sadly, we cannot confirm any number of the dead until after the war, but we do know that at least 200 Ukrainian children have been killed. 200 kids who will never have a life, who died before they were able to grow up. The thing is, this number may be higher, as Mariupol, the city that has been facing genocide by the Russian occupation for the past 4 months, have confirmed a death toll of a minimum of 10,000 people and 287 kids. This is just one city alone. Russia is throwing 500-kilogram bombs from the sky that are not only killing people but also obliterating them. Boris Romachenko, a 96-year-old man who survived 4 concentration camps during the Holocaust, was killed by a Russian bomb on March 21st when it hit his home. Do you know how they found him? Bones. Just bones. They did not find a body because it was burned by the explosion. They did not find blood because it was burned by the bomb. They found human bones scattered around his apartment. The only way officials were able to identify him was through his neighbors who knew that he was at home during the bombings. This is not the only case of suffering, as people are disappearing, leaving no trace that they had ever lived. Teenagers and kids our age are writing letters saying that they are simply waiting for death instead of writing assignments like this one. One of the letters, which I translated for you to understand, says, and I quote, "I am just waiting for death. I do not care if it comes anymore. I just hope that in death my body will be intact, that I can die with my head and my heart attached to my body." It is clear that people do not even have the hope to live anymore. People our age, only hope is to die with their body not being obliterated and separated. No one will ever understand the pain of these people, but the least we can do is sympathize with them. NATO fully acknowledges the fears and emotion Ukrainian civilians are feeling at this moment, yet still are not doing anything to stop the war. By not placing a no-fly zone law, they are letting these people suffer under the brutal times of war. This goes against NATO's ideologies, as their entire creation revolves around securing peace in Europe. By imposing a no-fly zone immediately, NATO will be able to assist innocent civilians and teenagers who do not have the will to live anymore, and avoid any other incidents such as the Boris Romachenko case. For my last argument, I would like to clarify NATO's incompetence in closing the sky, as they have every opportunity to do so yet refuse to act. In the past, Britain, one of the countries blocking the no-fly zone law, closed the sky over Buckingham Palace this January in 2022 because of the fear that the Queen would be assassinated. England has no problem closing the sky because of one person that may lose their life, but they cannot close the sky over thousands of people who are living and awaiting death. The UK's defense minister made a statement saying that Britain cannot impose a no-fly zone law because then Ukrainian aircrafts will not be able to fly over the closed sky. This is a lovely excuse, as any person can figure out that the no-fly zone law can have exceptions for Ukrainian aircrafts. This happened in 1993 during the Bosnian War, when NATO closed the sky over Bosnia and Herzegovina with the exception of certain aircrafts to help evacuate and bring resources for civilians. Another example is the Halab-Jabba chemical attack, which hit Iraq in 1998 during the Gulf War. This incident killed over 5,000 people in one night. Countries that are part of NATO quickly implemented a no-fly zone law over Iraq. The interesting thing is that this no-fly zone law was deemed illegal as it was not authorized by the United Nations. The no-fly zone law over Ukraine was not just illegal, it also fell apart from lack of support from neighboring territories. Near 1996, countries surrounding Iraq failed to prepare proper air defense to block those who crossed into the closed sky. We can argue that the closed sky over Ukraine will hold up as it has support from all of its neighboring countries. On March 31st, the president of Turkey spoke with President Zelensky of Ukraine to tell him that the Air Force is ready if the time comes. Poland, Romania, and Moldova have also expressed enthusiastic support to help Ukraine in their fight for freedom. Even Georgia has stated that they will help Ukraine in any way possible. Due to these statements and prior precedents, it is proven that NATO is simply ignorant and does not wish to help Ukraine out of political reasoning. NATO continues to justify their reasoning against the movement, yet has failed to show society concise political reasoning as to why it should not impose a no-fly zone law over Ukraine. Recap and conclusion. Concerning this controversial topic, the opposition might state that implying a no-fly zone law might create more harm than good in the context of nuclear war, that the contract will create economic problems, or the fact that Ukraine is not part of NATO and therefore does not have any responsibilities with the country. However, I, the proposition, believe these arguments can easily be disproven by my points. To recap what I mentioned earlier, NATO was in fact created to fight the Soviet Union, now Russia, in case of emergencies. Secondly, countries that are part of NATO agreed and signed a contract that in the event where Ukraine's independence or borders are compromised, then they are to protect the country in crisis. Thirdly, if NATO does not impose a no-fly zone law over Ukraine, thousands of innocent people will die, including children, the elderly, women, and men. Due to these main arguments, including other facts that I have stated, it would be wrong to suggest that NATO should not impose a no-fly zone law over Ukraine. In other words, by not creating this contract, NATO is putting countless lives at risk, going back on their own goal, and ignoring a previous legal resolution signed by members of NATO that is still an active contract, as well as past incidents that prove NATO's ignorance. Thank you, and here's my bibliography.